associate to just in order to get us started here today. So go ahead, T.
Hi, my name is T. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the Senior Gallery Associate here at New Harmony Gallery of Contemporary Art, which is part of the University of Southern Indiana. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the unceded lands of the Kickapoo, Kaskaskia, Osage, Shawnee, Miami, Muskogee, and many other Indigenous communities. While we know this is not enough, we recognize the ground we are on is the traditional territory of these Native nations who were forcibly removed, and that these lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. Joining us today are artists Dr. Sara Christensen Blair and Janine Polak, University of Southern Indiana Psychology Professor Dr. Aimee Mark, and our New Harmony Gallery of Contemporary Art Curator Audra Verona Lambert. Sara Christensen Blair, she, her, is a professor and the chair of the Art and Design Department at the University of Southern Indiana. She holds a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, followed by an MFA in Mixed Media from the University of North Dakota, with an emphasis in fibers, painting, and metals. The artist holds a PhD in visual arts, aesthetics, art theory, and philosophy from the Institute of Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts in 2022. As a mixed media artist, she contends with labor, craft, and the roles of these both play in contemporary culture. Janine Polak, she, her, grew up primarily in Virginia Beach. She received a Bachelor's of Art in Studio Art, Sculpture and Photography and Economics from the University of Virginia in 2005 and was awarded an ONSPA Fellowship at UVA the following year. In 2008, she earned an MFA from the Yale University School of Art, Department of Sculpture. Her work has been exhibited in solo shows and group exhibitions nationally and internationally. Polak is Assistant Professor of Art and Design and the Chair of the Arts Foundations Department at SUNY Purchase College and is based in Ridgewood, Queens, New York. Dr. Aimee Mark, she, her, has been an educator and scholar in higher education for over 20 years. She received her doctorate in experimental psychology, social psychology, and specializes in research involving issues of stereotyping and prejudice. Her work investigates the impact stereotypes have on individuals and how people can control their bias towards others. Currently, Dr. Mark is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Southern Indiana and the director of undergraduate advising, assessment, curriculum, and research for the department. Originally from St. Louis, Missouri, she is a first-generation Chinese American. Audra Verona Lambert, she, they, is an art historian and curator here at New Harmony Gallery of Contemporary Art. She has worked as curator for institutions such as Yeshira University and City College of New York, and was director at Amos Eno Gallery from 2020 to 2022. She has curated for over 12 years, and her writing has been commissioned by Texerkunst and White Hot magazine for contemporary art. Audra holds a Bachelor's of Art in Art History and Asian Studies from St. Peter's University, and they completed a Master's of Art in Art History and Visual Culture from Lindenwood University. I will now pass things over to Audra.
Thank you, T. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. And thank you again to our artists and our psychology professor from our staff. It means a lot to have you here today. I thought I would provide a short introduction to the conversation today. So let me, one moment. So when it comes to themes related to personal and collective histories, the fracture points of identity can very quickly show up and make themselves visible. We can remain as a part of a group that shares many identity markers, such as either queer, Black, or woman, while still possessing very distinct personal traits that may or may not fit a generalized view of that group identity, either from the insider's perspective or the outsider's perspective. That being said, I wanted to open up today's conversation with a look into the ways that how we present in society impacts how we are a part of histories from the collective viewpoint as well as the personal, and how this intersects with contemporary cultures rather as well. So we are lucky enough to be joined today by University of Southern Indiana Psychology Professor, Dr. Aimee Mark. Dr. Aimee Y Mark, which is important because all of your papers say Y Mark, Aimee. I found out when I was researching. So we're lucky to be joined here by Dr. Mark, who has significant experience publishing findings related to these identity markers, including the co-authoring of the papers When Sexism is Persuasive, Agreement with Hostile and Benevolent Sexism as a Function of Source Gender, which was published in 2015 in the journal Social Influence, volume 10, issue 4, and Standing Up for a Change, Reducing Bias through Interpersonal Confrontation, which was published in 2006 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, volume 90, issue 5. Today, we will be actively discussing visibility, memory, and how the histories that we construct can either add to or maybe detract from a fuller understanding of social dynamics in the world that we live in from both a social and a cultural perspective. So I wanted to start today's conversation with a reflection on the quote that I found in Feminism and Cultural Memory, an introduction, which is by authors Marianne Hirsch and Valerie Smith. And this is published in the journal Science, volume 28, number 1 from 2022, the autumn edition. Indeed, gender, along with race and class, marks identities in specific ways and provides a means by which cultural memory is located in a specific context rather than subsumed into monolithic and essentialist categories. So gender is a context, gender rather is an inescapable dimension of differential power relations. And cultural memory is always about the distribution of and contested claims to power. I thought we could start here with some reflections from Dr. Mark, who has significant research in this area. So I was hoping that you could start us out here, Dr. Mark, by discussing how visible gender relations and sexism are from your research, and perhaps maybe share and outline some of your findings in that area.
Sure. Well, so I mean, certainly we all know that sexism and gender are really highly visible kind of social categories and tendencies that we have. So when we as humans are obviously very much imperfect, and our mind has to condense and consolidate and use heuristics to simplify a very complex world. And so we tend to utilize heuristics like stereotypes and create categories to make life more, to make a person more efficient. But of course, we know that those categories are not necessarily true or reflection of reality. And then as we develop a patriarchal society, with certain power structures in place, then that engenders these stereotypes that serve to justify and promote the rationale for why there is this power differential. And so, yeah, I see these things as certainly part of humans and unfortunately the imperfections of humans, and that my work has really focused on recognizing the importance of seeing these flaws in us, and that we can certainly be incorrect in making assumptions, utilizing stereotypes that are not appropriate and are not a reflection of people because of their group membership. And so the bulk of my work has dealt with looking at how are we able to reduce bias towards other people, focusing on racism towards Black individuals and also with women, and sexism, and looking at ways in which we're able to either utilize self-control, as I want to be a better person, and not utilize these false heuristics, and try to improve myself. But also, are there ways or other strategies if other people are trying to intervene, right? An outside force. Are we able to, through things like confrontations with others, are we able to create change and to point out and to encourage other people to rethink and make better choices and decisions.
I hope this doesn't throw you off at all, but because you've seen the evolution in the field, have you seen any changes over time? Like perhaps in the past, like 5 to 10 years to 15, or is it pretty steady throughout? Like speaking of histories, have you seen kind of like any shifts in that history, so to speak?
Ooh. I mean, I think that there certainly is a shift. I mean, earlier history kind of focused on, right, how, right, being able to identify prejudice, right, not just negative attitudes. So with the benevolent sexism versus hostile sexism, right, that to understand that the prejudice isn't necessarily women are dumb and negative, but that potentially very positive ideals or ideas people have about women could be prejudice as well. Having these positive ideas of women should be cherished and put on pedestals, and they're good caregivers, and they're naturally warm and loving, while evaluatively very positive, are role restrictive. And again, another way to kind of subjugate women into a certain area or domain of work, and to believe that this is something they're just predisposed to, and to not think of women as other agents of change. And so I do think that the field is perhaps getting better at recognizing the vast ways that we can perhaps exhibit bias. So, right, in not only looking at explicit bias attitudes that people, clear negative, or in this case, right, the benevolent sexism positive attitudes, but also, right, the implicit, right, to understand that there could be other there could be other unconscious ways that we are affected that perhaps are due to our culture and our environment, our family life, that have seeped in, and we may not subscribe to those, but they somehow still are pervasive. And that's right, that's really problematic, because even if I hold egalitarian beliefs, right, my upbringing and the way that my mind has absorbed these cultural ideals still can kind of seep in there despite our best intentions. So I think that's an interesting progression. And obviously with more contemporary historical things that have happened recently, right, we have a greater awareness of these things as being concerning, right, that it's not just overt anymore, that we should recognize these more covert things. I think is more prevalent these days.
Whew, yes, that was very cathartic. Thank you. I'm glad I asked for more insight. So Sarah, I wanted to hand it over to you from here, Dr. Blair, and ask you to talk a little bit more kind of in dialogue with this idea of maybe visible histories in the context of, say, more of a personal perspective or personal memory. So when I think of the personal in art, specifically, when I think back to women artists through time, I may think of Sophie Calle, Liza Liu, Louise Bourgeois is another big one. So I wanted to hear more about your reflections as an artist on the personal versus the collective past, as features in your artistic practice. And then I was thinking of an observation by Mark Freeman in the scholarly article Telling Stories, Memory and Narrative, that Freeman says, remembering the personal past always takes place in and through language, history, and culture, meaning what is mine is always already permeated by otherness. I thought that was an interesting way to kind of have a removed sense of the personal when thinking about your practice. So I just wanted to offer that reflection and hand it over to you to share your thoughts.
Great, thank you. I think it's easy as an artist to talk about, like, because we're so close to our work, especially like the very much personal stuff. And sometimes it's so personal, it's hard to discuss. So I think I'll start with the idea of not going too personal, but sort of collective memory and how that impacts my own personal art practice. But I'm someone that will often tell you too much about it. So I'm going to hold back a little. But some of the shifts I've seen in the history of the discipline, but also in visible and invisible, histories. Some of the people that strongly influenced me as a young artist, but also as a young scholar, tend to be the essentialized woman, which, is someone that biologically born, technically a female, and that's I identify in that area, and I think one great thing, and I know Aimee touched on this a little bit, the great thing I think is that we're expanding that beyond just like the essentialized woman. That said, I do find my work sometimes problematic because it does live in that area still. It's like some of my most influential, the artists that I find the most influential and theorists, like Simone de Beauvoir is one of the people I use the most when I was thinking about labor and visible versus invisible labor. And I know, and I just want to state that I know she's like very, like, it's binary and it's very essentialized woman, but there's still, I don't want to lose it in the wash because it still affects the culture and how we talk about men and women and all the important in-betweens that we also are now finally recognizing. But I think the personal part of it for me is that I did grow up as an essentialized woman, and I do identify that way. So I always like to, I'm like very, I can't remember the philosopher, but like wanted to couch my statements and knowing that there's more than just the essentialized woman and binary, not, things are binary, not always binary, excuse me, very rarely binary, but because Simone de Beauvoir, one thing she talks about a lot is the idea of two different kinds of labor, one of them being imminent, like things you have to do to stay alive, like you have to make food and you have to care for others and you have to make sure these things happen so that imminently people can live. And that's primarily, especially when she was writing in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, like very much like the women's work, and it wasn't paid, obviously. And the other labor that she identifies as transcendent, which was the privilege of the men going out into the working world and having the time and place away from the domestic to think and do bigger things. Not all men, obviously, like we're talking about like the very white collar agencies, but I think that those are really interesting. It's always been a really interesting point for me to start a discussion of labor and visibility, because I think so much labor is invisible, even across the board, in the house, outside the house, men, women, non-binary, all of that. But the lack, I think, when I talk about my practice, I really feel like the things that really fall heavily on women still in culture, especially like Midwestern 2024 culture, are still very much rooted in social norms. And so I think when I think about other artists like Liza Liu, who really like encapsulates, freezes time, especially in her early work, domestic spaces with beads, which are like double domesticity, because beads are very much, especially in Western culture, like part of decoration, and then there's a longer history there, obviously, with others. And then also Louise Bourgeois really deals with the idea of mother, like being a mother, and that sort of experience and how that affects her work. I think that those ideas are still really relevant, and I think the important part is that we include more people, obviously, more types of people that identify different ways. But I think there's a lot to be learned and explored still on what hasn't changed. Like there's still an assumption that women are mainly the cooks and the cleaners. Like I have a 15-year-old son. He thinks it's weird that my husband does the cooking because all of his friends' parents, the mom does the cooking. Like, and that was a decision I made when I was very young. I'm not going to be the cook because I hate doing it. But I can't believe that my son is seeing these social norms so young. I mean, like he's 15, he's not that young, but it's still entrenched. And so in as much as we're talking about traditional heterosexual arrangements, it's still a problem that we're not taking that labor quite as seriously. Oftentimes, and it's not paid. And I also often refer to Marxism because I find Marxism so egalitarian theory, but they just sort of left out any labor that wasn't paid, because you can't really, all that important invisible labor, childbearing, child rearing, cleaning. And so I think that, the socialist, the feminist socialists tried to fix all that, but it was a little bit painful for them to fix, I think. But I think that those are really important. And in my own practice, I really like the idea of repetition. And when I think about imminent labor, things that have to be done, it's often very repetitive. Like you often do things over and over and over again. And I think you can get lost in like the banality of it, but I think there's a lot of beauty there as well, because when you do that, you also become very good at it. So I think a lot about, I have a piece that uses my grandmother's hands crocheting, which she's been doing since she was 12. And she's 96 and she's still doing it. And I asked her once if she thought of herself as a craftsperson or an artist, and she says, I'm a professional, which I thought was great, because she is a professional, because it is so repetitive and it isn't something you have to do, but it is very decorative. And it's the way that women in her generation were that's how they filled their entertainment time or downtime. And I think that that's an important thing to still note that we're dealing with, but also to look at the wear and tear that those repetitive labors have on people. Like Liza Liu, for instance, her first piece that she made, which is called Kitchen, it's a kitchen encrusted in beads, and she made it over 5 years and got really bad carpal tunnel. So like she can't do those things anymore, even though that's her art making practice. She's employed many people to help her with her new ideas. But I think that the visibility of labor is more, it's more obvious, but it's still not taken as seriously because it doesn't have, especially in the capitalist Western society, like it's not as important. It still doesn't feel as transcendent, even though I don't know if I agree with that word, but it still feels like something. I think sometimes, especially if you use any craft processes like I do in mine, people think that it's not something difficult. It just takes, you just do it, and there's not real meaning behind it. Whereas I disagree with that. I think there's a lot of, when you do storytelling and you talk about meaning and labor, you can do it in a more simple way that's more relatable, but it has more layers. And then the idea of otherness, like the idea that something's really personal, but it's also part of the collective. For me, that's just very much like you can never, nothing lives autonomously and that's very much my Derrida background. But the idea that you can never remove the frame from the painting, like they all affect each other. So I do think that it's just important to see where you fit in the personal, in the or meta, or like the collective consciousness of what's happening. And that, I find sometimes if you go too personal too quickly when you're talking about your work or you're doing scholarship, it kind of like, it narrows you down too quickly. So you have to be careful to share enough, but leave a little mystery so that other people can still relate to it. If that makes sense what I'm saying. But
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And it you actually brought to mind while you were talking about Simone de Beauvoir and kind of the idea of wanting to appreciate and respect what someone brings to the table while still having a critical eye towards how they could have brought more, if we're being frank.
right.
I
Yeah.
think of an exhibition that I saw last summer, and it was a Coda Lab residency here at the Governor's Island set of houses in New York City. And it was an exhibition by an artist named Chisha Tucker. And it was called It's a Most Peculiar Sensation, or That Time Virginia Woolf Wore Blackface. So the artist goes by they, them, and they were very enchanted by Orlando. And I myself, as a writer, am often very confounded by Woolf's writing and find it fascinating. And I learned through that show that there were ways that Woolf maybe was not showing up in the world, or perhaps showing up in a way that we would find insensitive now today, which at the time was viewed differently. If anyone's interested in that exhibition, it's on the Coda Lab website, and it was really fascinating. I encourage them to check that out. But just hearing you, like for anyone that is aware of maybe de Beauvoir's history and past and involvement in World War II, there's a lot of things there that intersect and overlap. And it just makes me think of how maybe collective histories, like you say, Marxism, can like start a movement that then can move in one way or another that's either positive or negative, when the person that's behind it may have flaws of their own. That is a whole separate thing from the movement itself. It kind of is able to evolve in a way that's not always reflective of the person, people. So when it comes to collective histories, the fact that that hegemonic cultural memory can be both, let's say, stifled and celebrated, suppressed and reclaimed. So that means that narratives can be constantly shifting. So Janine, I was hoping that you could speak to the reclamation of certain histories and memories extending throughout your practice, and perhaps speak to the ways in which the personal works can actually serve to be politically revelatory and champion collective visibility. Setting the blow for you there.
Sure. When I heard that question, a couple of things came to mind. I want to, and they sort of come off of our conversation that we had in the gallery. What was that, 2 weeks ago, with Sara and I both sort of circling around this idea of labor and gender. And I want to sort of second Sara's sort of contextual conversation around moving beyond the binary, but also existing within our history of binary systems in terms of gendered history within, Western culture. However we want to say it. Like,
I just remember well, it's Spivak. She does a really good job in her work, and I've always remembered that because I always wanted to use the idea of the essentialized woman and then be able to include more. Okay, I won't interrupt you again, but I finally remember the author.
Interrupt me as much as you want, but so recognizing that everything is not binary, but things have been very gendered throughout history in terms of stereotypes and what is women's work and what is men's work and whatnot. I think a lot about with my work, what has traditionally been women's work and what is men's work and what is appropriate for, all in quotes, what is appropriate for certain kinds of people to do, and what is appropriate for certain classes to do, and what is appropriate for certain, what is for different types of people. And I think about collectively, but also personally, my relationship with certain types of work and the friction I have with that kind of work internally. And I think that it probably reflects a collective problem we have with this sort of thing. So if I use an example, like my own relationship to cleaning, how I sometimes am very angry and resentful towards these certain tasks I have to do in my life. And I'm sure I'm seeing some smiles on the other end of the screen. But then there are moments in my life that I actually am a really clean person and I do enjoy. There is like a really large part of myself that does enjoy having a clean space. And certain times I like love putting on my ear pods and having a lovely home and keeping a lovely space, and it can be quite meditative. And there are certain tasks around my house that I love to do, and there is like a true pleasure and joy and meditative process to it. But then like there's certain times that I really hate it, and there is this true conflict that I have that often when I get into my head about it becomes a gendered problem in my head. And it often when it is in service of someone else is when that becomes the problem, right? And I can expand that to a cultural issue. Right now, I can expand it to, even as dumb as this sounds in an academic setting, TikTok, right? The idea of hashtag clean talk is a huge thing. People cleaning online on Instagram and TikTok is a huge realm. Like you can find thousands of people that clean for a living on TikTok, and it is really meditative. And I myself can watch people clean, and it's like really pleasurable to watch people like clean and organize their houses. But the second it comes into someone that's called like a trad wife or a traditional wife, where someone's like cleaning for their man, oh no, I won't stand for that, And so that it all sounds a little silly, but it is like this conflict about like what is like the pleasure and the joy and the beauty of caretaking. Like what is the difference between like caring and like loving someone and like caretaking for a child, and then when is it a chore? Like what's the difference between like care and chore? And that's something that I think is at the heart of a lot of what I do, and I think it's at the heart of a lot of what a lot of people think about probably in terms of the work they do. And I think it's a lot of what is at the core of undervalued work, gendered work, class-based work, labor issues in the world. And it's something I care about a lot. And I also, I wanted to mention, if I can share my screen, is that possible really quickly?
Yeah, let me set that up.
Yeah. If not, then I can easily just describe it. But I thought in case people don't know her work.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. If I can just share really quickly, another artist, Muriel Laterman Euclides. If people don't know her work, she's like one of my queens. I just wanted to share her work. If you don't know her work, she is someone whose work I think about a lot when it comes to labor, even though her work is really nothing like mine, because my work is sculpture, objects this is my work, sculpture, glass, drawings, sort of light work. But Muriel's work is performance-based. And so her work, this is her cleaning the steps of the Met. She was an artist, and when she became a mother, she started having people ask her like, well, how can you possibly, what are you doing? You're doing nothing. You're just a mom. You're doing nothing. And she said, well, I'm doing all this essential work. I'm doing all this important work. And so she started contextualizing the work she was doing in an art context. So she started cleaning the steps of the Met And she said, this is art, this is important work. And the most important work she made, that is maybe the most well-known, is she went around to the Department of Sanitation and talked to every single worker in the Department of Sanitation and shook their hands and said, thank you for keeping New York City alive. Yeah, in New York. And shook their hands, and it was called Touch Sanitation. And she shook every single DSNY worker's hand, and she actually got better living conditions working conditions. Made her basically a permanent artist in residence at the Department of Sanitation. She's had a studio at the DSNY that's like the size of a giant garage for many, many years. But she's someone that, if you don't know, she's someone I really think about in terms of gender and labor and work, and should be added to the list of, super important artists if you don't already know her. So,
but speaking of gender, that is one of the departments in New York City that is heavily gendered without women.
Yes, exactly. And it was interesting
at the time, that was the
woman,
80s, I think, right? Or the 70s.
Yeah. It was, yeah. And so it was interesting that she actually used her gender to her and her race as a white blonde woman to get better working conditions for mostly men of color, in an interesting way, to talk about work, labor, and cleaning, which you usually think about cleaning being women's work, but when it was professionalized, it was men's work. And so it was this whole complicated conversation. And so she basically went around and had these conversations with them about hey, what does it mean to clean for a living? I do it every day, but I don't get paid for it,
And if you do it for a living, you might be from a different, either race or maybe class as well.
Absolutely.
In a city that, if you look where people live on a map and the kind of jobs that they hold, a lot of that has to do with class and race, and just,
Absolutely.
It's not only in New York City either, but the idea that if you're of a certain class, then it's something that you do, as opposed to being say a TikTok influencer and you're cleaning for a hobby, right? Or maybe you're making extra money, but you don't
Absolutely
need, it's either needing something versus making it a hobby that you become known in. But I digress. I'm going to go back to the personal versus collective. Love seeing that, and feel free to explore those links. Regarding themes of memory and also personal recollections or personal memory, these can work sort of in a dual way as a means of obscuring actual events over time, or even heightening the resonance of certain aspects. So I think of how the Me Too movement is seen, when it first originally started versus how it's looked at now. And I would be really interested to see, maybe 20 years from now, how scholarly publications are able to view that movement in comparison to what we have seen and lived through. So I wanted to hear reflections from each of you regarding ideas related to public memory versus personal recollections. And then again, I just had a quote that I had pulled from Memory and Narrative, it's called Telling Stories, Memory and Narrative. The fact that memory is always already mediated, that does not mean that it is irreparably tainted and impure. So I thought you could, if each of you could speak to the personal versus the collective histories in a way that embraces the subjective aspect of memory and what you do in your professional practice. Should I start with you, Dr. Mark? I see you nodding. May I hand it to you? Okay.
As far as kind of personal histories go, I think for a psychological standpoint, thinking about memories as, right, when we have our own personal memories, we tend to think of them as, this is what happened, right? I was there, I saw it with my own eyes. I was there, but the research suggests that there are several instances where research has shown, well, again, right, we're imperfect humans, and that we are prone to misremembering things depending on the situation. So flashbulb memories that we think are these real emotionally charged and important moments in our life. We think those are reality, or we think, I know what happened, I know what I was wearing, and I know every bit about that moment. But research suggests that even those can be incorrect or flawed in some way. And with eyewitness testimony as well, in the research looking at the way people are questioned could greatly affect what they report. Leading questions can lead to kind of inaccurate reportings of people, and testifying against people that were right, are not guilty. And so I think from a psychological standpoint, right, the personal histories, I think, are what can be more subjective, obviously. And we think, right, when you think about the Me Too movement and things, certainly there is a personal reality to things. But when we take the collective look, I think, right, you suspect that you might get greater clarity, right? When initially with Me Too, right, men were maybe reactive and thinking, this isn't me, like I'm not, like don't blame me, I'm not like that. But as time wore on, right, the collective, more stories, more information getting out about these are all these people who have been assaulted and who have been suppressed and subjugated to this assault and a systematic, problematic world that really puts women at a disadvantage, right? That collective history started to become more, I think, recognizable and to men because they didn't experience those realities. So in a sense, right, that collective can be less subjective, right? Men can't say, well, right, well, I didn't do that, that's not me. But as a collective, we can say, like, these are happening. And so in that way, that collective can be less subjective, but it's kind of weird because as history goes on, like you said, 20 years from now, will we have a different view of that Me Too movement? And so, right, it's an interesting kind of thought of, well, that collective brings some objectivity, but we again have to think of it in the context of a point in time and a cultural point in time as well. And so right then there is some subjectivity in there. So the lines, right, continue to be blurred into subjectiveness, I think.
You want, I can say something to it. It's a little bit different from what Dr. Mark was talking about. But as far as history, and I think about where we are with social media and documenting history right now. I had a conversation a few years ago, it's probably been a decade or so ago, with a cousin of mine who is a historian, and she was saying that she was really excited about where we were with social media in terms of documenting food, just because we were going to have so much more information about what kind of food we eat as a record, because in the past we only really saw obviously like what noblemen ate, right? What was like a feast for like wealthy people, like just like, we have a records of like what, I mean, you just study the history of paintings, like you just see like what wealthy people's homes looked like, what wealthy people wore, right? And that's all that was preserved. But now that we really see, we're not actually seeing what people eat like on their normal Tuesday night. We're seeing what they like eat when they go out to like a fancy meal, or like what they prepared on a beautiful Thanksgiving. We're not actually seeing like your average like Cheez-It dinner. Like we're still, it's still mediated. So I am kind of curious, like what version of history are we going to be seeing now? It is like is it distilled? Is it purified? Is it an excess? Like for me, I'm not an excessive poster. I'm like a super distilled poster. It is kind of curious. I'm interested. I know it's like a very different answer what Dr. Mark was saying, but it's something I think about a lot in terms of what kind of collective history are we creating for future generations, in terms of what events, what moments, what version, and then you bring in filters and AI and all of that. It's like, what version of history are we recording right now? Like, what are the adjectives that people will apply to this version of the record,
Yeah, but it's not so different because you have an editor
Yeah,
for like
exactly.
history of modern art, or like there's always
Totally.
you have the editor with the vision, who's the lens.
Yeah.
And again, that has a lot to do with the intersections.
Yeah. But we're editors right now, and there were editors back then. It's like, it's just, I'm just curious, like what it's the adjectives that I'm curious about, like where, purified, but excess, but
and how things are viewed. Yeah. And I think like one thing I am super grateful for is I think we have actually grown to appreciate the lens and the impact it has for us as individuals when we are working within our profession.
And recognize it, and hopefully recognize that it exists.
And recognize race and class and gender and all these things that make up how we see what we are. As you mentioned, like it's like, how are we distilling, not just what are we distilling?
Right.
Sarah, it's your turn now.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I'm going to go back to the Me Too, like now versus 2017 versus the future. I think I've been working. I'm going to go a little more personal with this because it's always kind of makes. I'll expand it. I'll go the other way, but I've been working in higher ed for quite a while. I started teaching full time at 20 when I was, in 2006 when I was 28, I think. And I used to think like, oh, I can't. We were so progressive, like, and this is like 2006, 2007. And then when Me Too happened, and I remember I had a little bit of Title IX training, and Title IX is the federal law for, most people think of it as like the equal play for sports, but it's also now very much like the mechanism for dealing with sexual assault on campus and all those sorts of things. And I think I just remember the training I got pre-Me Too was like, don't sexually assault each other, and like it was very just like they had to do it. They were very flippant about it. And one thing that I've noticed that's really changed as a collective is how much more we have to do. And I don't disagree with the training. I think it's important, but how we are taking it more seriously, at least the institutions are. And I don't know how much of that is litigious, like how much is based on our like making sure we don't get sued and people aren't aware of it. But I do at least think at least we're talking about it a little bit more. And some of that I think has to do with the society we live in and like covering people's, CYA all the time. But I just thought about my own personal experience, like the evolution since 2006 till 2024 as an academic, female academic in higher ed, two different institutions. But I think that there is a little more care in the words we use, but I still think so much of it is still there. It's just become a little more subversive and a little more subtle. But I think there's still quite a bit of, and I know Aimee or Dr. Mark can talk a lot more about this because of the study of sexism. But I think this is because progress is not linear. I think we have taken some steps forward, and I think there's been some backlash, and it's not dissimilar to how I feel about presidential races in the last 20 years, how I thought we were going forward, and then we took big steps back, and who knows what's going to happen. Not to go there, but anyway, I also think about how it's affected the people around me personally. Like, I have a very lovely, my dad is great. Like, he's just like a really wholesome Midwestern, like very good person, actually believes most people are good, and I love that about my dad. But he worked in corporate America for 35 years. And I remember him saying to me in like the early 2000s, like, I don't know if I ever experienced any, like witnessing any sexism or anything like that. And I thought, wow, he doesn't even know what it looks like. Like, he doesn't. And then so when I talk about my experiences that I've been very sexist in the workplace, he's starting to see it. And then when he hears about Me Too, so I do think like that's a very personal relationship. But when you get closer, and as my dad always says, the perspective changes by proximity. I do think there's going to be there's a little bit of reckoning that's happening with people and how they view things. Like for me personally, like I went the opposite way with unconscious bias. Like there's this, and this is going to sound terrible, but like I remember like there's always this stereotype, like a white woman and coming across a black man at night and they go across the street. Like I consciously don't, like I'm like, oh my gosh, like I don't want to be that person, right? So like there's these new consciousness that I maybe didn't even realize, not that I was crossing the street ever, but I'm like really hyper aware of it. And sometimes I think that affects me. So I'm curious like what the backlash will be from like the very being conscious of unconscious bias, but also how it can affect the way we navigate the world. Those were kind of like sort of tangential, but I do think in for me, the Me Too movement and like talking about it, and I feel like Black Lives Matter falls into this. I think it's good to have these sparks, but I don't think the fire, like not enough logs on there to keep it going. Like if you think about it as a fire, like we're really good at starting little fires, but we're not good at maintaining them as a collective because we all have like, I don't know, the inability to focus, but also it has to come to a certain amount of collective experience like Me Too for it to make any reverberations in actual society, especially if you're studying a lot of theory. Like I remember my dad saying to me once, well, the laws have been passed, but everyone has equal rights. And I'm like, yeah, they've been passed. That doesn't mean they're working. Plus, we still can't ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So like, it's just funny how some people, especially in a place of like white male, middle upper class privilege, like he thought everything was fine until he started seeing it more closely. And I think I'm hopeful that more people will do that, even myself. Like I'm in a very privileged place as like a white female. But I also hope that everyone starts to see things differently based on these little fires that are happening that need to happen and be maintained, such as the Black Lives Movement and Me Too. And I think as educators, all of us it's the only thing we can do is bring it to the classroom and make sure we talk about it. And not, I remember I had a male student that was really upset with the idea that we weren't using men for human anymore, people. And I said, well, like, what if we switch it all to women? And I remember him being really upset. And then now he's probably like the most progressive student I've seen come up, like for years ago, it was like 2006. And he's like very, he got it. Like it took him a minute, but it got it. And I think in those safe places of education, people can see things differently and understand the collective and the personal.
I think what's nice is in an exhibition, especially with art objects like sculpture, it sort of pulls someone in, like it draws someone in, and then you can have a conversation that's kind of meeting the road where it's at. It's not like overwhelmingly didactic. And that's one thing that I was really excited to work with you both on the exhibition about, but then also for the talk that's happening today. I also think of the Stop Asian Hate movement that was here in New York in the wake of the pandemic, and just feeling like there are so many conversations that when they're had in a way that feels more like, why do you feel that way? I mean, I don't want to get overly into therapy, but this idea of having an exchange and just hearing people out and understanding that you probably have ways that you don't see the world and that it is very meaningful to see it a little differently, which leads us, I think, to the conclusion of today's conversation. And I just, again, wanted to thank all of you for your time. I'm super excited that we are recording this and we'll be able to share it afterwards. So just opening up the floor to ask, at what points each of you feel that perhaps the personal and the collective histories that you are living have either diverged, and also perhaps where they happen to converge. I mean, if you can speak to either specific movements or actions or activities or things that you've done. I was thinking about joining, and I actually joined in with a group. It was called the PES Incubator. The Project from T-Space Incubator had a it was a group trip from the New York City area, from Newark, New Jersey, and we went as a group to join the Women's March in 2017. So it was a bunch of, I would say, strong women, and it was, yeah, I think it was women and queer. It was a multitude of genders who joined all together to be part of what was called the Women's March on Washington, but it was not, again, to your idea of the binary, it was not exclusively binary, but it was all folks in the arts, which I think feel sometimes social inequalities in a different way, maybe, than the world at large. I would say, so I was thinking about being a part of just like one in a sea of almost 500, like almost 500,000 folks there that day, which I was reading after was the largest recorded crowd on the Washington Mall since the anti-Vietnam War protests. And it just, I mean, from a personal perspective, like we had to get up early, like we stayed over actually at one of the founders of Project for Empty Spaces homes. Like she opened up her actual home to us, like her childhood home, and we stayed there, and it was, I think, about 20 or 30 of us, and we had to wake up early. We went like the subways, or sorry, the metro, I'm not sure what it's called in DC, but the underground train there, it was like everyone was just literally like pouring out of the stations. And it was really inspiring, empowering, and overwhelming, because there were also folks lined up to kind of heckle as well. So there was that experience. I just wanted to, like, through sharing that, kind of share my hope that each of you could perhaps open up or speak to a point where like what you were working on at the time, either from a research perspective or in your studio, was perhaps a part of a larger social movement, or even maybe if it happened to diverge, and kind of reflect on how you look back on that from today. I realize that's a bit of a winding question and reflection all in one, but if someone wants to kick us off with that.
I can start, because it's very clear, and I won't go on too long if you don't mind. There's three different points where I found the collective history and my own practice converge and then diverge and then converge again. The first one was when I was in art school. I was a painter. I was only going to paint because that's what artists do, right? Like we paint, or we sculpt. And I realized I had so little to paint about. I didn't know what to do anymore. Like I painted and we got pretty good at it technically, had no idea what to say with it. And then I started really going back into my personal history with all of my family members being craft artists or crafters or whatever they want to say they were, professionals. And that's when I found a lot more like personal connection, but then that I really found that that opened up the collective reception. Like people were, oh yeah, I remember cross stitching, you know, and then it really helped maybe bring some more of the subject matter that I wanted to discuss forward, such as, you know, sexism, labor, things like that. So that was one of them. When I thought the world was maybe, the next one was when I thought the world was starting to really figure out that women and men, and that's not really a binary statement, but more equal rights were important. Maybe this is like the second Obama. You know, I remember being in the first Obama election. I was in a group of students as the election results were coming, and they were just so excited. And then after the second administration, and then when Hillary Clinton lost to Trump, I felt personally betrayed by the entire country. Like, I don't know if anyone else felt that. Like, I was like,
Me
what?
too. Like I felt personally attacked.
Yeah, I felt like they really don't take us seriously. Like they don't give a shit about us. Like they really, like, you can grab them by a pussy, you can be a total horrible human, and all they care about is their money and their status, and they're so afraid of women and people.
From a
Like I thought,
positive- No, sorry, go ahead.
what? Oh, and I was just so mad. But
Yeah.
but it
From a
was very, it
positive
was also,
perspective, I just wanted to add that Mexico just elected their first woman president. So
yeah.
there are
Yeah.
also positives in the world.
But I couldn't believe it. And I was going in the order of like the history of voting, like white men, black men, women. So I was like, all right, all these weighty presidents, finally white men, and like, all right, we got a black, maybe women will like, oh, we got like the opposite, you know. And you know, I understand. I've always wanted to be one of those people that understands why people choose to follow certain types of political, you know, like I want to understand. I don't agree with it. And I know they're coming usually from a lot of times from like a one issue thing. And that's there, here nor there. But to be upset about emails to not elect a woman, and the man 5-6 days before talked about like, it was just so heartbreaking that my art practice went back to painting pretty pictures because I didn't know what to do. I was stuck. I painted pretty pictures for 3 or 4 years. I didn't do anything else, and I still like them, but I couldn't make really deep work because I felt like, what's the point? Like I got pretty upset about it, clearly. But then the other convergence, so that's where I diverged with my own practice. But the other convergence is I have a child that identifies in the LGBTQ plus with LGBTQ plus population, and I've been to a few pride parades, and holy smokes, like you're talking about the when you went to DC, like it's so refreshing to know that you can, as a collective, support something, be an ally, and so I think, not that my work really deals with that, but I do think that there's going to, like I said, you know, it's never linear, but I do think there's going to be points where you have to take, not to be Pollyanna, but you've got to go with positive things, even though there's a lot of negative, and that will inform your practice and the consciousness of what you're doing and the people around you. And hopefully that reverberates in a good way. Those are my 3 divergent convergent spots. So.
I just wanted to say I'm happy you're back from painting sometimes. That's all. That's my reflection.
Oh, yeah, it's like, I think, and a lot of artists are like, we were just talking about like being the Jane or Jack of all, or whatever.
Yeah.
Of all trades, master of none. And then it reminded us that it's better to be the you know, instead of the master of none. But
Yeah.
I think it's okay. I think when you're an artist or you're a researcher or anything, an academic, a curator, you're going to go in ways where you need a break from something. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
I will stop.
I can talk about a convergence. For a few, I saw this image of I'm going to share a screen again just so you guys can see this. I saw an image. I took a photograph. Oh, wait,
I have
sorry.
to throw you in again. Hang on 1 second. I have to throw you in the mix to do that. Okay, go ahead.
This is a drawing I made that is based off of a photograph that I took at a park. Oh, wait, I tried to leave the meeting instead of sharing the screen. This is a drawing I made a few years ago based off of a photograph I took at a park in Brooklyn of why can't I think of the word? A chain link fence that was like desperately trying to be repaired with like zip ties in Brooklyn. And I'm not a drawer. Sure, I can draw, but this is like not actually a hard thing to draw. It's just like very rudimentary shading. But I'm not a very actually good drawer. I really am not. It's like this kind of thing takes me a long time, and I just don't usually have the time to do this kind of thing. But in 2020, as you know, the world shut down with COVID, and I no longer had access to the usual kind of facilities I have access to make my glass sculptures, my ceramic sculptures. And I was obviously starting to think about things like borders. So convergence of a bunch of things happened. I was thinking, obviously, for a very long time, our country has been thinking about borders, like the southern border of the US, right? When Trump came into office, that became like an even larger thing. I have family, like I'm currently right now in Florida with my brother and his wife, who is from Venezuela. And as you all know, the Venezuelan situation has gotten even like larger in the news and become like this, like, I don't know, demonized situation that has become like really prevalent in my family. So borders have been on my mind for a long time. And then I started thinking about the borders that we started to have to create within our own bodies, like that were important. Like, so what were borders that I thought were kind of like silly, the borders between countries, but then borders that were important to me, like borders across my face to protect me from crazy viruses, borders that then started to happen like when the Black Lives Matter protests started happening and people started like suddenly really, really caring about personal property and suddenly like personal property borders and like the borders between like personal property and private land and public land became really important to people. All of that became, you know, very much in the news, and like suddenly you broke a window and that became more important than like someone's property of their own body, right? And so all of those things started kind of converging. And that photograph that I had made probably in the year 2008, I was like, oh, I should finally start making those drawings of these chain link fences that I've been putting off for a long time. Because I'm sure, like Sarah, you probably have those kinds of like pieces that you know you want to make, but they're going to take you like 30 hours and you're like, I don't have time. But suddenly I had time because everything converged when I was like, I'm not going anywhere. So all that kind of came together. And so I suddenly had the time to sit down and make drawings and teach myself how to just like be patient and make graphite drawings instead of work in my studio. So yeah. And Audra, I should mention that I also was at the March on Washington that day. I took the bus down from New York at 2 a.m. that morning. And protests have been very important in my life for many, many, many years. I've been to many, many protests. And so also those, I don't know, they work their way into my work somehow, even though my work is not loud. That kind of, it somehow worked its way in somehow to my work. Yeah. It feeds my work.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, it also might just hold space for you to make work within.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Okay, so I guess I'm up next.
Yeah, you are.
Well, so I guess kind of the personal convergence in my work. So with my graduate school advisor and mentor in early 2000, 2001, she began to kind of investigate empirically the power that confrontations can have on eliciting change in others, in reducing the use of stereotypes towards African Americans, and to see, right, in what ways can we or should we deliver these confrontations? Does it matter who does the confronting, right? In cases of racism, a Black or white confronter, right? Does that matter? That at that time, the work was really in its infancy. There was not much empirical basis to say that confrontations would work, and kind of long story short, right, they are effective, and luckily they were. We were able to demonstrate empirically that, right, whether you're Black or white, we could find that people would reduce their use of stereotypes regardless of if they were interacting with a white or Black confronter. So that work, I think, is from the past, kind of converges with modern day, right? We see, right, with that confrontations are unfortunately, right, with the boiling point of Black Lives Matter, and also with Me Too, right, that we are seeing that pushback, and that people are now, right, very much comfortable with confronting in some way, shape, or form, which is good to an extent, I think, certainly. But I think maybe we're in the future, right, to diverge, is that we're able to confront so many people in so many different ways, right? Initially it was thinking, well, face to face or people that we know, but now with the internet, right, since 2000, right, and we flash forward to 2024, right, with the internet and tweeting and the online kind of sewer that exists now, right, you can confront somebody all day, every day, and right, is that dynamic gonna elicit change? Maybe not, right? So I think where it is maybe important to kind of diverge is while there's empirical evidence to say that confronting people, hey, that was offensive, hey, that wasn't appropriate, hey, that hurts, while that is appropriate in some situations and needed still, certainly, I think we need to better understand how can we create a dialogue, right? Because you're not listening, right, with right, Democrats, Republicans, right? We can confront each other all day long and say, you're liberal and you're crazy and you're Republican and you're an idiot, or, just, you can confront all day long, but we're not listening, right? And so I think that's where we need to better understand how do we, we know how to get our message out, but how are we able to really start to listen or come together or recognize each other as not just some abstract thing, but right, these are real people that are just like you and me and flesh and blood, that are scared in some respects, right? We don't understand maybe the far right, or people, the right might not understand the left, but underneath it, there's fear. So why are we scared, or what, and if we understood that, I think we could maybe better hear each other. But when we're just confronting each other, it may not be as maybe effective as we think it is. So that's why I think, I guess, to wrap it up too, with the art, I think the art kind of, right, it's wonderful to kind of hear your art, your wonderful work, and to hear you speak about it, to kind of, right, to get that, the personal, to understand those connections, and to hear those stories and really kind of be able to have that dialogue, to be able to understand these things, I think gives us that conduit, right, through art. And if we're not listening, we can reflect on the art, and maybe through that art, we can feel more open to these messages, I think.
What a beautiful way to wrap that. And hedging on your point about listening, we might have time to listen to a couple questions. If anyone has any, no pressure. Otherwise, we can probably wrap. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask someone something specific or reflect on a theme. So you can feel free to check out more of the artist works on their website. You have Janine Polak's website here in the chat, as well as Sara Christensen Blair's. If you are searching for publications by Dr. Aimee Y Mark, make sure to look for the Y Mark. It's M-A-R-K. You have her name here in the announcement for this talk. And we hope to see you at the gallery. Just as a reminder, the current exhibition, Making Memories, Sara Christensen Blair and Janine Polak, is up through July 20th. And we will have closing art activities that day from 3 to 5 p.m. Central Time, as the gallery is in New Harmony, Indiana, which is in Southwest Indiana and Central Time. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you in the gallery soon. Thank you to all of our participants. Thank you, T. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone, so much. Dr. Mark, it was a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, it was lovely to meet you virtually.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.